Tonight we enter a quiet gallery where the air smells of old varnish and candle smoke. A single canvas waits in the half-light, veiled by silk, as if the paint itself could whisper. Footsteps fade. What remains is a feeling, like a door has opened somewhere inside the dark. We begin mid-breath, inside a silent hall where marble saints watch the floor. No tours, no chatter, just the soft hum of lights and a curtain that hides one forbidden frame. They say this painting disturbed men trained never to flinch, not for its colour or skill, but for what it seemed to say without speaking. You do not need to know the artist's name to feel it. The first glance loosens the ground. Lines curve in strange ways. A hand points not to heaven or earth, but to a third path, drawn like a narrow thread through the centre of the scene. In the corner, a symbol repeats 3 times. Simple, clear, unwelcome. The church guards many things: faith, memory, order. It also guards quiet. Some images soothe the flock, others ask questions that echo. This canvas did the second. Monks called it a wound. Curators called it a riddle. A few called it true. Tonight, we will walk between frames, past velvet ropes, into the hush where decisions were made. We will meet the restorer who found a layer beneath a layer. The archivist who swore the sketch matched a band diagram. The novice who dreamed of the painting before she saw it. We will not accuse. We will not shout. We will listen. As you drift, let the story unfold in small steps. A discovery in dust, a name erased in a ledger, a note written in the margin of a prayer book. The painting may be only wood and oil, or it may be a mirror the size of a door. If you feel the tug, let it guide you. The night is kind to travellers who move with care. We will go slowly, and we will return. The corridors of the Apostolic Palace sleep differently than the city beyond its walls. Rome at night carries the hum of scooters, the call of a late drinker, the sound of fountains that never stop. But within these marble halls, silence is not absence, it is command. Every footstep is muted by centuries, every breath slowed by stone that remembers. It is here, in one of the narrow galleries far from the tourist routes, that a curtain waits. Not velvet red for show, but a pale fabric, coarse as sackcloth, hanging before a single frame. The air smells of oil and dust. Candles once burned here, long enough for the walls to remember their soot. Now, the only light is electric, faint, pressed against the cold. The other paintings stand proud saints gazing upward, martyrs glowing in resignation, angels in gold. They are the vocabulary of faith, images meant to soothe and direct, but this one canvas does not belong. Its edges are rough, its stretcher warped from time, and the curtain before it feels less like protection and more like warning. A restorer once wrote in her diary that approaching the painting felt like stepping into the quiet after thunder. She never described the image, only the hush that seemed to gather around it. Guards whisper that the curtain is unnecessary, that no visitor ever comes here at midnight, but still it hangs. For in daylight, the painting unsettles. At night, it disturbs even the silence. They say the first man who pulled the cloth aside did not last the hour. A junior archivist, eager to impress, he carried the keys with trembling pride. He expected the usual saints in odd proportion, gilding half erased by time. What he found instead was a hand painted larger than life, pointing not upward, not downward, but forward, straight through the centre of the scene. That was enough. He closed the curtain again. Later he wrote one line in his report: "This image moves the gaze inside itself." The phrase was odd, almost nonsensical, yet it stayed. Scholars would later debate what it meant, but the archivist never clarified. He left the library a week later, refusing to explain why. The silence he carried seemed heavier than any explanation. Visitors rarely reach this corridor, but those who do sometimes pause. They stand before the curtain, sensing something unspoken. It is not the awe of Michelangelo's vault, not the grandeur of Raphael's room. It is smaller, more personal. A whisper in a place designed for choirs. The curtain protects, but it also tempts. Every fold suggests a secret, every crease a question. What kind of image must be hidden when even the Vatican, custodian of centuries of strange art, prefers shadow to sight? There are stories of monks who guarded the gallery at night. They described strange dreams after their shift, dreams of corridors that looped back upon themselves, dreams of doors that opened only to reveal more doors. Some swore the painting visited them, not the other way around. They would wake, sweating, with the sense that they had stood within the frame itself. The church kept no record of these tales, but men who guard rooms for decades whisper freely in candlelight. The curtain at midnight is more than fabric. It is a line drawn by centuries of caution. It says, "Not now, not for everyone." Yet behind it waits the brushstrokes of a hand long gone, an artist whose name survives nowhere but in the faint tremor of paint that still glows when touched by light. No bells ring when the cloth moves, no alarms sound. But those who have stood in front of it, even for a breath, agree on one thing. Silence itself feels altered, as if it has been painted too. The restorer did not begin with belief. She began with solvents, brushes, and patience. Her world was measured in pigments, in cracks that told time like tree rings, in the quiet scraping of varnish that revealed centuries of neglect. She had cleaned masterpieces that drew pilgrims from across the world, and she had touched canvases forgotten even by their patrons. For her, paintings were not sacred objects, but puzzles, each layer a decision, each brushstroke a confession. When the assignment came, a minor work, tucked away, requires stabilization, she thought little of it. She arrived with her lamp, her magnifiers, her gloves. The gallery was cold. Dust lay thick along the skirting, as if no one had breathed there in years. The curtain was drawn back only for her. She noted the stiffness of its fabric, the faint smell of incense caught in its folds. At first glance, the canvas seemed ordinary. The composition was simple, almost stark. But as the lamp's circle of light fell upon the surface, something shifted. The pigments did not rest as she expected. They shimmered faintly, refusing to settle into one colour, a red that hinted at orange, a blue that leaned toward green. The painting did not stay still. It breathed with her, or perhaps against her. She leaned closer, brush in hand, and saw the smallest of fissures. Beneath the surface colour, another tone whispered through an underlayer, richer, deliberate. She had seen such things before, artists who changed their minds, compositions revised, but this felt different. The lower paint was not correction, it was intention, hidden with care. She lifted a speck of varnish and revealed a mark that looked less like a shadow and more like a symbol. Her lamp caught it, 3 strokes intersecting at an angle, simple, geometric, almost mathematical, not flourish, not ornament, a sign. She recorded it quietly, but did not note its shape in her official report. Some things live better in memory than on paper. As the days passed, she worked in silence. Yet, each evening when she stepped away, the image seemed altered by her touch, as if it responded to her presence. She began to notice details that unsettled her calm, a gaze that followed her, though no face turned, a line that appeared straighter one morning than it had the night before. The hand at the centre, pointing forward, seemed to reach closer with each session. She did not tell the archivists. Their questions were blunt, their answers heavy. She preferred her own silence. But in her private journal she wrote, "This painting does not wait to be cleaned. It cleans the one who watches it." The phrase lingered. She found herself restless at night, dreams scattered with corridors of shifting perspective. Once, she woke to find her hand raised in the same gesture as the painted figure, pointing into the dark of her room. She lowered it quickly, but the echo of the motion stayed in her chest. The restorer's lamp became more than light. It was confession, interrogation, witness. Under its glow, varnish lifted like smoke, revealing not correction but hidden intent. She sensed that the painting had been layered to deceive, to survive scrutiny without yielding truth. Yet each solvent stroke peeled back the disguise. The deeper she worked, the stronger her unease grew. In her final report, she wrote only, "Stabilized. Recommend continued restriction of viewing." But in her journal, hidden in a drawer, she confessed, "The image refuses silence. It asks questions without words. I fear what it knows." The smell of varnish clings to memory long after the liquid dries. Sharp, resinous, half pleasant, half suffocating. It was the scent that filled the gallery as the painting revealed itself in fragments. Each layer of coating that should have preserved its surface seemed instead to smother it, as though time itself had tried to bury what the brush once dared. The silence of the room deepened with each hour of work. Not the comfortable hush of a library, nor the reverent pause of a chapel, but something stranger, a silence that leaned in, listening. The restorer would pause, brush suspended, and feel as though the walls waited for her next move. Beneath the varnish, figures began to emerge. At first, faint outlines, then clearer. Yet none matched the expected canon of sacred art. There were no halos, no radiant skies, no thrones of light. Instead, the figures stood in stillness, their eyes level, their gestures plain. They did not look upward. They looked outward, at whoever dared to stand before them. One evening, as she cleaned the lower corner, she revealed a detail nearly lost to decay, a set of initials, faint, almost erased. Not the artist's signature, but perhaps a note left behind. The letters did not match any known painter of the era. When she traced them, she felt as though her hand shook, though the room itself was still. She wrote nothing of it in her official record. Some discoveries resist documentation, but she lingered on the thought that perhaps the painting was never meant for the gallery at all. Perhaps it was created for private eyes, for a circle who understood its signs. The varnish that had once protected the painting now seemed complicit in its concealment. Each flake removed uncovered not only colour but meaning, and each meaning weighed heavier than the last. The silence of the room grew denser, pressing against her ears, her breath, her thoughts. It was as though the painting did not want to be unveiled quickly. It demanded patience, demanded surrender. She remembered one phrase from her training. Every painting teaches the restorer what it needs. Some need firm cleaning, others gentle strokes. But this one taught through silence. It said nothing, yet commanded everything. As the last layers thinned, the figures stood more clearly. The hand still pointed forward. The thread still divided the scene. And the gaze of the painted eyes seemed to widen, not with fear or devotion, but with invitation. An invitation that unsettled, because it did not say where it led. The gallery remained locked. Few would ever see the progress. But those who did guards passing, clerks peeking, left quickly. They complained of a weight in the chest, a sense of being called, of being watched. None wanted to stay. Only the restorer kept her post, her lamp steady, though she too wrote in her journal, "The varnish is gone, the silence remains, and it asks more than I can answer." The room carried a hush so dense it felt like fabric. Dust motes drifted through the cone of the restorer's lamp, their descent so slow that time itself seemed altered. Her brush paused against the canvas. What had first appeared as discoloration now resolved into something sharper, something intentional. 3 strokes, that was all. Not ornate, not hidden among swirls, but plain. 3 small marks placed near the lower right corner, subtle enough to vanish beneath casual eyes. But under the light, they glowed faintly, as if they had been waiting. The restorer leaned closer, magnifier steady. The strokes were not random. They intersected at precise angles, not unlike the diagrams she had once seen in ancient manuscripts' geometry dressed as ornament. They were not letters, not numbers, not anything belonging to the expected canon of religious imagery, and yet they carried a weight that words often fail to hold. She thought of the archivist's report, the one line he left behind. This image moves the gaze inside itself. Perhaps he had seen the marks too. Perhaps they were not meant for the casual viewer at all, but for the one who lingers, the one who dares to look beyond paint. The silence pressed deeper. The longer she stared, the more the 3 marks seemed to shift, not moving, but altering their meaning. At times, they resembled a pathway, 3 steps leading forward. At other times, they were stars, small points guiding through dark, and sometimes they felt like wounds, scars, on the surface of a painting that itself had become a body. She did not write about them in her report. Instead, she wrote in her private journal, 3 strokes, more precise than letters, more demanding than words. I feel them in my chest, not just my sight. At night, she began to dream of corridors marked with the same symbol, walls lined with torches, each corner bearing 3 slashes, as if guiding her deeper. She woke with the sense that she had been walking through a place both ancient and alive, a place that waited for her to continue. The marks followed her into her waking thoughts, appearing in the grain of wood, in the cracks of stone. One evening, as she set down her tools, a guard paused at the doorway. He glanced at the canvas, then quickly turned away. "Strange," he muttered, not realizing he spoke aloud. "It has eyes." When she asked what he meant, he shook his head, embarrassed, and left without explanation. The painting had no eyes, not in the way of saints or angels. And yet, the 3 small marks looked back, not like pupils, but like witnesses. They did not offer answers. They posed a question so quiet, it unsettled. What do you see? Not what is here, but what do you see? The restorer felt herself pulled, as if the marks were more than pigment, more than symbol. They were an opening, small, plain, and endless. In the Vatican archives, names live longer than flesh. Artists known, unknown, forgotten, all recorded, catalogued, assigned their place in the long chain of sacred art. But when the restorer searched for the painter of the hidden canvas, she found only erasure. The name, once inscribed in a ledger, had been scratched out with deliberate force, not blurred by time, but struck by hand. The gap was unnerving. In a library where even minor apprentices earned footnotes, this absence was not neglect, it was verdict. Whoever had created the painting was not simply forgotten, they had been removed. She ran her finger across the paper. The ink beneath the scratch lingered faintly, as ink always does. But the exact letters refused to appear. At most, a curve, the ghost of a consonant. Not enough to build a name, enough only to suggest that someone once dared sign their work. She asked the archivist, the one who still remembered the whispers. He looked at her with a patience that bordered on pity. "There are reasons some names are lost," he said softly. "Not all silences should be broken." She returned to the gallery unsettled. The painting seemed to hear her footsteps, to lean closer as she approached. The hand in the centre, pointing forward, looked more deliberate than before, as if the absent name lived through that gesture. The unnamed master. That was what she called the artist in her mind. A hand that refused to align with the safe grammar of holy art. A brush that placed marks where saints should have stood. A vision that unsettled the guardians of order enough to scratch their name from history. She began to feel a strange reverence toward the absent signature. More than pity, more than curiosity. It was as though the act of erasure carried its own power. To remove a name is to admit its danger. To fear its memory is to acknowledge its reach. The artist's absence filled the room more loudly than a presence could. One evening, she stayed longer than permitted. Alone with the painting, she whispered to the silence, "What did you see?" The words slipped out without thought, a question for the artist who was no longer there. The gallery did not answer, but her heart quickened, as if a reply had already been given in another language. Later, in her journal, she wrote, "The one without a name speaks more loudly than the rest. To erase is to confess. Someone feared this hand. Someone still does. And perhaps that was the truth of it. Not that the artist had been lost, but that their work had been too alive, too direct, too unwilling to bow. A master unnamed, because a name would make the painting harder to bury. The silence around the painting thickened. And within it, the restorer felt not emptiness, but company. The analysis began quietly, with the simple scrape of pigment sent to the laboratory, standard procedure. Every painting carries the story of its materials: earth ground to powder, minerals burnt to hue, plants and metals turned into colour. By tracing these, scholars find place and time, but the results that returned unsettled the tidy order of the archives. The pigments did not match. Ultramarine, where no ultramarine should have been, drawn from lapis mined far beyond the artist's supposed reach. A yellow that bore traces of saffron, rare, reserved for manuscripts, not canvas. And the binding medium a resin unknown to the region, perhaps carried by travellers, perhaps mixed in secrecy. The archivist frowned at the report. Borrowed, he muttered. These materials were borrowed. As if the artist had painted not with tools at hand, but with gifts, contraband, or offerings. The restorer thought differently. To her, the mismatched pigments were not accident but intent. They spoke of someone who sought beyond borders, someone who touched materials meant for other purposes. A painter who borrowed not only brush, but vision. She considered the three small marks again. Their geometry matched the precision of someone trained outside the common schools. Perhaps they learned from manuscripts, from diagrams meant for study rather than devotion. Perhaps the borrowed brush carried more than paint. It carried forbidden knowledge. At night, she began to imagine the painter at work. A dim studio, not in Rome, not in Florence, but elsewhere, quieter. A figure grinding lapis with deliberate care, mixing it into resin that glowed faintly in lamplight. The hand steady, the brush moving across canvas with the certainty of one who knows they are being watched, yet paints anyway. Borrowed brush, borrowed time. Perhaps the painting itself was a borrowing, a vision pulled from another source, placed into oil and wood so that it might survive the centuries hidden in plain sight. The restorer's dreams grew more vivid. She dreamed of holding a brush not her own, dipping it into pigment that shimmered like liquid stone. Each stroke she placed on the canvas in the dream appeared already finished, as if guided by another hand. She would wake with her fingers stained, though in the morning light they were clean. The archivist grew uneasy with her questions. "Leave it," he said once. Some borrowings were never meant to be returned. His words lingered, though he refused to explain them. Still, she could not stop looking. Each pigment, each borrowed colour, each stroke of the brush, seemed to call not only to her eyes, but to her memory, as though part of her already knew this work. In her journal she wrote, "The brush was borrowed, but from where? Perhaps not from another hand, but from another time. Perhaps the painting is itself a memory, placed here for us to recall when we are ready." The silence around the painting deepened once more, and in that silence the borrowed brush still moved. The convent was quiet that season, its cloisters wrapped in late autumn air. The novices moved like pale shadows along stone halls, their lives patterned by bells, prayers, and silence. Among them was one who rarely spoke. She was young, too young to know the heavy history of the archives, yet not so young that her eyes failed to notice the strain in her elders. She dreamed. At first she told no one, for novices were discouraged from speaking of visions. Dreams belonged to saints and mystics, not to girls still learning their vows. But her dreams returned, night after night, clear as daylight, and always of the same thing, a painting. She described it later in her journal. Secret words pressed into paper that smelled faintly of candle wax. In her dreams, she stood before a canvas, veiled by cloth. The curtain was always pale, always heavy. When it moved aside, she saw not saints, not angels, but a hand pointing forward and 3 marks at the corner like scratches on stone. She had never seen this painting in waking life. Yet her dreams repeated the same image with such clarity that she woke trembling. One night, she confided in her confessor, an old priest too tired to scold. He listened without comment, his gaze steady, his hands folded. When she finished, he told her to forget it, to treat dreams as mist. But when she looked closer, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as though he too had once glimpsed what she described. Weeks later, her duties took her to the gallery. She carried a bundle of linens, simple work for simple hands. She did not expect to wander beyond the usual paths. Yet somehow her feet carried her to the long corridor, where dust thickened, where silence grew heavy. She stopped before the curtain, her breath caught. Though she had never stood there before, she knew the place instantly. It was the same as in her dreams. She dared not pull the curtain aside. Her vows bound her to obedience, and obedience meant silence. But her body trembled with recognition. She whispered a single word, yes, and turned away. No one saw her leave, but she carried the memory like fire in her chest. That night, her dream changed. She no longer stood outside the painting. She stepped into it. The figures around her were not painted, but alive, their eyes steady, their gestures simple. They looked at her, not through her. The hand that pointed forward seemed to guide her into a narrow passage cut through shadow. She walked until she reached 3 marks carved into the wall. She touched them, and the stone opened like a door. Then she woke. She told no one after that. The confessor would only dismiss her. The sisters would only frown. But in her journal she wrote, "The painting is not only on the wall, it waits in the night. It knows me, though I do not know it." In time, she disappeared from the convent. No record explained why. Some said she transferred to another house. Others whispered she fell ill. Her journal remained, forgotten in a drawer, until a century later it found its way into the hands of a young archivist who noticed too much. The journal contained only fragments, but one line stood out. The door opened where the 3 marks met. I was not afraid. The novice who dreamed was never mentioned again. Yet her vision lived on, haunting those who stumbled upon her words. It was as though the painting had chosen her first, sending its image into her sleep before she had ever seen it. And so her silence became part of the canvas itself, a hidden echo in its layers. In the library beneath the palace, books breathe differently. Their pages expand with the damp, contract with the dry, each carrying not only words, but the lives of those who touch them. Archivists walk softly there, as if footsteps could tear parchment. It was among these shelves that a thin ledger was found, bound in faded leather, corners worn to velvet. The ledger listed paintings catalogued in a certain year, most routine, each with dimensions, subjects, and donor names. But beside the entry for the hidden canvas, there was no name. Instead, in the margin, a note written in hurried hand. Images that instruct without words. The phrase unsettled, the archivist who discovered it. Sacred art was always meant to instruct. Paintings of saints taught virtue. Scenes of Christ taught sacrifice. Madonnas taught compassion. But always through clear symbol, known story, shared language. This margin note suggested something else, an image that bypassed words entirely, reaching deeper than instruction, past the catechism, into something raw. He traced the handwriting. It was not the same as the main ledger, which was neat and formal. The margin note was personal, scrawled in haste, as if the writer feared being overheard even in ink. Perhaps it was the hand of a clerk, or perhaps of a witness unsettled by what they saw. The archivist copied the phrase into his private notebook. He did not mention it to his superiors. He felt the same chill the restorer once described, the sense that some discoveries resist the safety of official reports. He began to notice the phrase echoing in his thoughts, images that instruct without words. He wondered what such instruction would be, a command, a revelation, A question? That night, he dreamed of turning pages that contained no text, only shapes and colours arranged like diagrams. He woke uneasy, with the impression that the shapes had spoken more clearly than language could. In the weeks that followed, he found more marginalia scattered through other volumes. Small notes, short phrases, never part of the official record, better hidden than seen, too direct for display, keep in shadow. Each hinted at unease, as though the painting had been observed by many, each compelled to write their discomfort in the margins but not in the main record. He began to suspect a pattern. The official documents preserved order, faith, and clarity. But the margins carried truth, and the truth was simple. The painting unsettled those who looked too long. He visited the gallery once, late, when the curtain was drawn back for inspection. He stood only a moment, enough to see the hand pointing forward, enough to glimpse the 3 small marks. He left quickly, heart unsteady. Later, in his own notebook, he wrote one sentence in the margin of his copy. The image instructs by silence. He never spoke of it again. His notes, like those before him, slipped into the tide of forgotten papers. But together they built an unseen commentary, a chorus of whispers written between lines, proof that the painting's influence did not rest in pigment alone. The margins became part of its frame. It was always the hand. Visitors who glimpsed the painting, whether by chance or permission, always remembered the hand first. Not the figures, not the background, not the strange thread cutting the scene. The hand dominated. It was painted larger than proportion allowed. Not grotesque, but undeniable. Its gesture refused the expected directions of sacred art. In most paintings, hands point upward to heaven, or downward to earth, or inward to heart. But this hand pointed forward straight out of the canvas, toward the viewer, past the gallery wall, into the space of whoever looked upon it. The gesture was not command, it was not blessing, it was invitation, and that unsettled more than any accusation could. A Jesuit scholar once stood before the painting for only 3 breaths before turning away. He later wrote in his private diary, "It does not tell me where to go, it tells me to choose. That is unbearable." For centuries, the Church had directed the faithful, guiding them with certainty. But here was a hand that demanded no obedience, offered no doctrine, only pointed forward as if to say, "You decide." The restorer, too, felt the weight of that gesture. Each evening, as she packed her tools, the hand seemed to follow her, not as a threat, but as a question. In her dreams, she raised her own hand in imitation, pointing into the dark, feeling the vastness of choice open before her like a sea. Some who saw it swore the hand shifted slightly, depending on where one stood. From the left, it pointed toward the corridor, from the right, toward the door. From the centre, it seemed to point straight into the chest of the viewer. A trick of perspective, perhaps, or perhaps intention. The archivist, who feared the margin notes, wrote one last phrase in his notebook. The hand points elsewhere. Elsewhere is within. He left the archives soon after, his reasons never stated. The painting did not shout. It did not argue. It simply pointed, and in that gesture lay its danger. For those who saw it were left not with answers, but with freedom. Freedom to walk a path unspoken, unblessed, unchained. And freedom is heavier than law. The hand that points elsewhere continues to reach across centuries, through curtain and shadow, through varnish and silence. It asks nothing. It commands nothing. It only extends itself into the space between painting and viewer, where the choice waits. And those who have seen it know, once you feel its gesture, you can never quite turn away. The gallery was dim when the restorer noticed it. Not at first, her days had blurred into careful strokes of solvent and soft cloth, the routine of patience that left little space for revelation. But one evening, as the lamp's circle of light passed across the canvas, she saw it, a line. It was not bold, not drawn with confidence, like a border. It was subtle, nearly invisible beneath layers of colour. Yet it cut through the painting with steady purpose. dividing the image into two halves. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The line began near the hand that pointed outward. From there, it travelled straight down, bisecting figures, slicing through background, continuing into shadow. It made no sense in the composition. Painters avoided such divisions, knowing they unsettled the eye. But here it was deliberate. The restorer leaned closer. Beneath the surface paint, the line appeared darker, as if drawn first, before the colours were laid. It was not correction, it was foundation. She traced it with her gaze, from top to bottom, and felt something shift in her chest. The figures on the left seemed softer, gentler. Those on the right, sharper, more alert. The line made them two worlds, sharing one frame. Unity split, harmony unsettled. She recalled the phrase from the margin note, images that instruct without words. This line did not instruct in theology, it instructed in division, in choice. That night, she dreamed of walking a narrow corridor. On her left, doors opened into gardens. On her right, doors opened into libraries. The corridor stretched endlessly, the line running beneath her feet. At the end stood the same hand from the painting, pointing not forward this time, but down toward the line itself. She woke before she stepped. She wondered what the line meant. Some said it represented the path between heaven and earth. Others whispered of secret diagrams used by mystics, lines that separated outer self from inner. But no consensus could soften the unease. For the line did not feel symbolic, it felt real. A young guard once confided to her that he hated standing near the painting. "It feels like it could split me," he whispered. His words stayed with her. She returned to her lamp. The line was patient, it never shouted, but its presence altered everything. With it, the painting ceased to be scene or story. It became mirror. She wrote in her journal, "The line is a door without hinges. It opens not outward, but inward. To cross it is to step inside." And with that, she understood why the archivists feared it. For a line can be erased in words, but once seen by the eye, it lives in memory forever. The archivist worked quietly in the long stone hall. His fingers moved across pages brittle as autumn leaves, each sheet a fragment of history too delicate to endure much longer. He was searching not for paintings, but for patterns. For weeks he had been haunted by the line through the middle, by the 3 marks in the corner. They resembled something he had seen long ago, in a volume of diagrams forbidden for use, sealed except to scholars with clearance. But memory is stubborn. Shapes linger longer than words. One evening, unable to resist, he returned to the locked shelves. His lantern cast a small circle of light as he pulled down a manuscript bound in cracked leather. Inside were pages filled not with prayers, but with diagrams, geometries of spirit, maps of consciousness, sketches that monks once drew to guide meditation. These were banned centuries ago, deemed too direct, too dangerous for common eyes. There it was, a vertical line dividing a square. At the base, 3 marks forming a gate. At the top, a hand-shaped symbol pointing not upward but inward. The resemblance to the painting was unmistakable. He felt his chest tighten. This was no coincidence. The artist had known the diagrams, had drawn them into pigment. What had once been pen and parchment had become oil and canvas, hidden in plain sight. The archivist copied the page into his notebook, though his hand trembled. He knew the risk. To link the painting to the banned diagrams was to admit what the guardians had long denied, that sacred geometry had survived, embedded where no one thought to look. He studied the text beside the diagram. The translation was rough, but the meaning clear. The line is the path within. The 3 marks are the threshold. The hand is the guide who does not lead, but invites. The archivist closed the book quickly. His lantern flickered. He felt watched, though the library was empty. That night, he dreamed of a square room divided by a line. On one side stood figures who prayed. On the other, figures who acted. In the middle stood the artist, brush in hand, silent. The dream ended with the artist erasing his own name. In the morning, the archivist sealed his notebook in a drawer. He told no one. But he carried the weight in his eyes, and those who met his gaze afterward sensed a shadow there. The band diagram was no longer confined to parchment. It lived in the painting, waiting for anyone willing to look long enough. When unease grows too loud, meetings follow. In a chamber lined with wood panels and narrow windows, a handful of men gathered. They were not artists, not restorers, not dreamers. They were guardians. Their task was simple: to keep order. On the table lay reports, restoration notes, pigment analyses, fragments of archivists' journals. None spoke openly of the painting's effect, but each page hinted at it. Words like disturbing, unsettling, divides, unfit, the margins told more than the sentences. The men read in silence. The restorer was not invited. The archivist was absent. Only those trusted with discretion remained. One broke the quiet. "It is not blasphemy," he said carefully, "but it unsettles." Another replied, "Unsettling can be more dangerous than denial. Doubt spreads faster than fire." They discussed options. To display it would risk questions. To destroy it would leave a gap too obvious. To lock it away seemed safest. One suggested covering the marks. Another advised repainting the line. But such acts would admit fear, and fear was not the image the church wished to project. Finally, an older man spoke. His voice was slow, each word considered. "The danger lies not in the paint, it lies in the gaze. Whoever looks too long begins to listen." His words settled heavily over the room. No one argued. They agreed to keep the curtain. They agreed to limit access. They agreed to say little. Silence would be their shield. When the meeting ended, the men left in quiet procession. No signatures, no records, no votes. Only understanding. The painting would remain, but unseen. Alive, but muted. That night, one of the men dreamed of a hall divided by a curtain. Behind it, he felt a presence, watching, waiting. He woke with sweat on his hands and chose never to return to the gallery. The quiet meeting became another layer of varnish over truth. Not destruction, not revelation, only preservation of silence. The curtain at midnight hung heavier than before, not just cloth now, but decision. And still, behind it, the hand pointed forward, the line cut through, the 3 marks waited. The gallery at night was never truly empty. Guards walked the marble floors with soft soles, their shadows stretching long beneath dim bulbs. Keys jingled softly at their belts, the sound as steady as a rosary. Each key opened a door that led to another silence, another secret. But one key was different. It opened the door to the curtain. The man who carried it that winter had worked in the Vatican for decades. His hair was silver, his steps measured. He had never been curious about art. His duty was protection, not beauty. He trusted the paintings to those who understood paint and varnish. Yet the ring at his hip carried the weight of centuries, and the one key, small and darkened with use, unsettled him. He did not like opening that door. The gallery beyond felt heavier than the rest, as though the air itself resisted intrusion. He would pass quickly, eyes forward, never daring to glance at the curtain. But sometimes the cloth stirred without wind. Sometimes he thought he heard the faintest sound of whispering, though no one else was there. One night, restless, he paused longer than usual. He turned the key in the lock, the sound echoing too loudly. The door swung open, and he stepped inside. He should have continued down the hall, but the curtain drew him. His hand hovered near the fabric, trembling. He pulled it aside just enough to glimpse what lay beyond. The hand, always the hand, pointing outward, steady, unyielding. The guard froze, his breath sharp. The figures around it blurred at the edges of his vision, as though they cared nothing for his gaze. Only the hand remained. It seemed to point not into the room, but into him. He let the curtain fall quickly, heart racing. The silence after was unbearable. That night, he dreamed of walking endless corridors, each door opening with his ring of keys. But every door led back to the same room, the same curtain, the same hand pointing into his chest. He woke with the keys clutched tightly in his fist. The next day, he asked to be reassigned. He never explained why. Another man took the ring, another hand carried the weight. But the story spread among the guards, quietly, like smoke. They called it the key that watched back. The painting remained locked, the keys remained on their ring. And each man who carried them wondered, sooner or later, whether it was the door they opened or the painting behind it that held them captive. The restorer returned to her work with new caution. She had already revealed much, the line that split, the marks that invited, the hand that pointed elsewhere. But the canvas still breathed secrets. And one evening, under infrared light, she saw it the ghost of another image hidden beneath the visible. The underlayer revealed faint shapes, too blurred to name, yet deliberate. Figures arranged differently, symbols drawn in outlines, erased by later strokes. The painting had not begun as the world saw it now. It had lived another life first. She leaned closer, tracing the contours. There was a circle where no circle appeared above. Within it, a triangle. Beneath, a figure kneeling, not in worship but in contemplation. The hand was present, but it pointed inward, not outward. The composition was altered, inverted, hidden. The discovery unsettled her. Painters revised often, but this was not revision, this was concealment. Someone had built the visible painting atop another truth, covering it carefully with layers of oil. Two paintings lived within one frame, one public, one private. She felt a strange kinship with the hidden image, as though it whispered to her alone. At night, she dreamed of scraping away not varnish but time itself, layer by layer, until she reached the first vision. In her dream, the underpainting glowed brighter than the finished one, as though it were the true heart. She began to suspect that the artist never intended the outer layer to endure. Perhaps it was camouflage, a mask to protect the deeper message from erasure. Perhaps the real painting was always beneath, waiting for the patient eye. Her journal grew crowded with sketches, attempts to capture the shapes revealed by the light. She wrote, "The surface is sermon, but beneath lies confession. What we see is what was permitted. What waits beneath is what was meant." When she shared her findings with the archivist, he paled. He knew the diagrams from forbidden texts, the shapes that matched her sketches. He warned her softly, "Do not speak of this. The outer painting is tolerated. The inner one will not be." She nodded, but the knowledge burned in her. She could not unsee it. She carried the weight of both paintings, now the one of pigment and curtain, and the one that lived in ghostly shadow beneath. The layer beneath was not silence, it was voice, and it spoke more clearly than any word she had ever heard. The archivist, unable to rest, returned to his forbidden manuscripts. He wanted to understand the underlayer, the first vision. He traced the shapes the restorer had sketched, compared them to diagrams once used by mystics to chart the soul's ascent. The resemblance was too exact to ignore. The first composition, it seemed, was not of saints or martyrs at all. It was a map. The circle symbolized the infinite, the triangle, the union of opposites, the kneeling figure, the seeker poised before revelation. The hand pointing inward suggested not divine authority, but inner journey. It was not an image for worship. It was an image for transformation. He understood then why it had been buried. The church could not allow such direct invitation. To tell the faithful they needed no intercessor, no hierarchy, only themselves that was more dangerous than heresy. It was freedom. The archivist shivered. He imagined the artist, brush in hand, laying down the first composition with steady faith. Perhaps the painter knew it would be censored, covered, hidden. Perhaps they layered the outer painting deliberately, preserving the inner vision beneath, trusting that one day it would be seen again. a secret gift to the future. He wrote in his private notes, "The true painting is not what we see, it is what waits beneath." The hand was first turned inward, guiding the viewer not to church or creed, but to self. That night, he dreamed of standing before two paintings side by side. The outer was familiar, the hand pointing forward, the line dividing, the marks at the base. The inner glowed faintly, its shapes pulsing with quiet light. He reached toward it, but a voice whispered, "Not yet." He woke with his hand extended in the dark. The restorer, too, grew restless. She began to see the underpainting in every reflection, in the sheen of polished floors, in the shimmer of water. It followed her, as though the first composition had stepped free of canvas and into her world. The painting now lived in layers within layers, surface for the guardians, hidden truth for the seekers, dreams for those who dared to look too long. Each layer was complete, yet incomplete without the others. The archivist and restorer both understood, though they never spoke of it aloud. The painting had been designed not only to be seen, but to be revealed slowly, century after century, like scripture written across time. The first composition was not erased. It was waiting, and those who discovered it knew once you see the painting beneath, you can never again believe the surface alone. The figures in the painting were unlike any the restorer had seen before. At first, she mistook their posture for the familiar hands joined in prayer, bodies arranged in quiet reverence. But as she studied under the steady glow of her lamp, she noticed what set them apart. Their eyes were not lowered, they were not fixed upon heaven or cast downward in humility. They were open, direct, awake. The longer she looked, the more the gaze unsettled her. These were not saints resigned to martyrdom, nor worshippers surrendering to authority. They were witnesses. They looked outward, meeting the viewer without hesitation. Their eyes seemed to say, "We see you. What will you choose?" She leaned back from her easel, unsettled. Sacred art was meant to guide, to soothe, to offer certainty. But these figures offered no such comfort. They placed the burden back upon the one who gazed. It was not prayer as petition, it was prayer as awareness. That night, she dreamed of standing among them. She joined her hands as they did, but when she closed her eyes, she felt their attention upon her, warm yet unyielding. She opened her eyes and saw that none of them moved. They stood silent, still, yet alive with presence. It was not worship of something beyond. It was recognition of something within. She woke trembling. She wrote in her journal, "They are awake while praying. This is not worship, it is awakening. Their prayer is not escape, but seeing." When she confided in the archivist, his face turned pale. He admitted he had seen similar images once, hidden in manuscripts never displayed. Diagrams of contemplatives whose posture mirrored these figures. Hands folded, eyes wide, gaze steady. The texts had been condemned long ago as dangerous. They taught that prayer was not words, but presence, not obedience, but awakening. The restorer felt the truth of it in her bones, for each time she returned to the painting, she felt more awake herself. She noticed details in the room she had overlooked, the shift of dust, the faint smell of wax, the rhythm of her own breath. The figures taught not by doctrine, but by example. One guard, braver than most, once asked to see what she worked on. She allowed him a glimpse, no more than a moment. He left quickly, whispering, "They look at you, they know." He refused to pass the gallery again after that night. The painting did not demand devotion. It demanded honesty, and honesty unsettled more than blasphemy ever could. The restorer wrote again in her journal, "Hands in prayer, eyes awake. They pray not to escape the world, but to inhabit it fully." Perhaps that is what terrified those who tried to bury this work. It does not teach obedience. It teaches freedom. The figures remained, silent yet alive, waiting for each viewer to meet their gaze and decide whether to look away or to awaken. The line through the middle had already unsettled her, but as she studied the composition further, she realized there was more. The painting did not simply divide left from right. It offered something else, something subtle, something hidden in plain sight. Between the figures, between the halves, ran a narrow path. It was not painted boldly. It was a sliver of space, a suggestion of movement, an invitation to walk where no one expected a way to exist. Not left, not right, but between. The restorer felt her breath catch as she traced it. She remembered the archivist's whispers about forbidden diagrams. She remembered the novice's journal entries. The door opened where the 3 marks met. The path seemed to lead exactly there to the base, where the 3 marks rested like a threshold. The church had long taught 2 ways, the way of devotion, the way of discipline, but here was a third, a way that did not choose one side or the other, a way that walked directly between. She dreamed of it soon after. In her dream, she stood at the start of a long corridor divided by shadow. To her left lay gardens, lush and fragrant. To her right, halls filled with books and chant. Both beautiful, both inviting. Yet between them stretched a narrow passage of light, so thin it seemed impossible to walk. The hand pointed, not to the left, not to the right, but directly into that narrow beam. She stepped into it. She felt no ground beneath her, yet she did not fall. She walked, supported by something unseen, and the path carried her forward into brightness. She woke trembling but calm, as though the dream had carried her somewhere real. She wrote, "The third path is the way between. It is narrow, invisible, unless you dare to look. It does not ask for loyalty to heaven or earth, only for trust in the space that connects them." The archivist grew troubled when she told him. "The third path was always the most dangerous teaching," he whispered. "It leaves no need for gatekeepers. It makes the seeker their own authority." She asked him why that was dangerous. He did not answer, but his silence spoke enough. The painting showed the third path not with proclamation, but with suggestion. It was there for those willing to see, hidden from those who refused. And once seen, it lingered in the mind forever, like a secret passage you cannot forget. The restorer began to feel its presence even outside the gallery. When she walked the city streets, she noticed narrow alleys between buildings that she had never seen before. When she prayed, she felt a stillness between words, more powerful than the words themselves. When she closed her eyes, she felt a line of light running through her, dividing yet uniting, guiding her forward. The painting taught her not by command, but by presence. And the lesson was clear. There is always a third path, invisible, waiting, alive. The archivist uncovered the story first. Buried in a manuscript of maps, faded with time, was a sketch unlike the rest. It was not of rivers, nor of mountains, nor of cities. It was a map drawn inward, lines and shapes arranged as though charting the terrain of the soul. The name at the bottom belonged to a monk, long forgotten, known only for his devotion to copying manuscripts. Yet this map revealed something else. He had seen the world differently. He had tried to chart not land, but spirit. The sketch bore striking resemblance to the painting, a line through the middle, 3 marks at the base, a hand-like symbol at the top, and along the sides, tiny figures drawn in prayer, eyes open, steady. The archivist showed it to the restorer in secret. Her breath caught. The resemblance was undeniable. "He saw it first," she whispered. "The painter was not the beginning. The monk was. The monk had been a cartographer of the inner world. While others drew coastlines, he drew thresholds. While others marked rivers, he marked paths of awakening. His sketch was not meant for geography. It was meant for guidance." The archivist explained that the monk had been censured in his time, his work dismissed as error, his maps locked away. But some fragments remained, hidden in collections too vast to cleanse entirely. The restorer wondered if the painter had known of the monk's work. Perhaps the painting was not invention but continuation. Perhaps the canvas was a translation of the monk's inner map into visible form. That night, she dreamed of sitting beside the monk. He drew lines on parchment, his hands steady. He did not speak, but when he finished, he slid the paper toward her. On it was the same map, but brighter, alive with light. She looked up, and he had vanished. She woke with the sense that his work had never ended, it had simply passed into other hands. The archivist grew more troubled. "If this is true," he said softly, "then the painting is not just art. It is cartography. It is a map we are not meant to follow." The restorer disagreed. "It is meant for us," she whispered. "Why else would it endure? Why else would it call us?" She carried the monk's sketch with her afterward, tucked in her journal. She looked at it often, tracing the lines with her finger. Each time, she felt the map shift, not changing, but revealing more, as if it were alive. The painting, the monk's map, the forbidden diagrams, they were all pieces of the same truth. Not invention, but inheritance. A lineage of vision passed quietly from hand to hand, from brush to brush, from soul to soul. And those who followed the map found themselves not in places, but in awakenings. The cartographer monk had drawn not the world, but the way through it, and, centuries later, his lines still guided, hidden within a painting veiled by curtain, watched by silence. The gallery had always been still, its silence more enduring than stone. But after the archivist discovered the monk's map, and the restorer uncovered the layers beneath, the stillness shifted. It no longer felt like peace. It felt like a pause before sound, a quiet alarm, too subtle for bells, too soft for words. The guard noticed it first. He was young, newly assigned to the night watch, unaware of the painting's whispered history. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the narrow hall. He slowed as he passed the curtained frame, though he did not know why. The curtain seemed heavier than fabric, as though it was stone draped in cloth. He felt the air pulse against his chest, faint but insistent, like the beating of a second heart. He did not pull the curtain aside, but he sensed that something waited behind it, not sleeping, not dormant, but awake. The silence pressed upon him until he turned away quickly, his breath shallow. That night, he dreamed of a hand reaching through fabric, brushing against his shoulder. He woke trembling and requested reassignment the next morning. The restorer felt it too. Each time she approached, her tools felt lighter in her hands, as if the air thinned around her. She noticed how the lamp flickered, though its bulb was new, how the varnish seemed to resist her strokes. The painting no longer revealed itself with patience. It resisted, like something that knew it had been disturbed. She began to feel watched, not by the figures with their open eyes, but by the painting itself, as though it held a presence beyond pigment. It was not hostility, it was vigilance. She wrote in her journal, "The painting knows it is being seen. It waits for something, or someone." The archivist confessed a similar unease. He had returned to the manuscripts, tracing diagrams with trembling hands. Each time he closed the book, he felt the pages hum faintly, though he knew it was impossible. "It is awake," he whispered to her once. Not the figures, the work itself. The alarm was not sound, but sensation. Guards spoke of dreams that clung to them, dreams of corridors repeating endlessly. Visitors whispered of unease without knowing why. And the restorer, though trained to endure hours of silence, found herself leaving earlier each day, unable to bear the painting's gaze. It was as though the act of unveiling the underlayers, of recalling the monk's map, had stirred something that had long been content to sleep. Now it watched, it waited, and those who stood too close heard the alarm, not with ears but with skin, a quiet alarm that no one could silence. The restorer had spent her life in galleries, yet she often thought of the spaces where paintings were born. Not marble halls, not chapels, but small rooms filled with dust, oil, and silence. Studios where brushes clattered, pigment stained fingertips, and canvases leaned against walls waiting for light. One evening, she closed her eyes and tried to imagine the studio where this painting had begun. She pictured a narrow room lit by candlelight, its air thick with the smell of turpentine. The artist bent over the canvas, brush in hand, laying down the first lines of the forbidden composition. A circle, a triangle, a hand turned inward. She imagined the floor covered with dust, the kind that clings to boots and robes, carrying fragments of the outside world into the sacred act of creation. As she worked on the restoration, she began to notice specks embedded in the varnish, tiny particles, no larger than grains of sand. At first, she dismissed them as dirt, but under magnification, she saw they were fragments of stone and wood, unlike the dust of galleries. They were dust of a studio. She realized the artist had carried their world into the work itself. Every brushstroke bore not only pigment, but the breath of the room, the dust of the floor, the silence of the hour. The painting was not just image, it was place. To look at it was to stand in that hidden studio centuries ago. She dreamed of it soon after. In her dream, she entered the room. The walls were bare, the floor scattered with pigments ground into powder. The artist was there, faceless, moving with calm precision. She could hear the rasp of grinding stone, the hiss of brush against canvas. She smelled resin burning in a small dish, the air heavy with its sweetness. The artist never looked at her, yet she felt their awareness of her presence. She stood in silence until the dream dissolved. When she woke, her hands smelled faintly of resin, though none had touched her. She wrote, "The painting carries not only image but place. The dust of the studio still breathes through its cracks." The archivist, when told, nodded gravely. He explained that certain traditions taught artists to mix fragments of their environment into their work deliberately, ashes, soil, salt, so the painting carried the essence of its creation. Perhaps the artist had done the same, sealing their world within the frame. The realization unsettled her. She no longer felt she was restoring a painting. She was restoring a room. Each stroke brought her closer, not to the figures, but to the space where they had been born. And in that space, she felt the artist's presence more vividly than ever. The dust of the studio was not forgotten. It lived in the cracks, in the varnish, in the air of the gallery. And each time she leaned closer, she felt she was breathing the same air the artist once breathed, as though the centuries between them had thinned to nothing. The archivist was not prone to imagination. His work was ink, parchment, dates, and names. Yet the more he studied the notes and diagrams, the more he felt haunted not by what was written, but by what was not. One evening, while comparing copies of ledgers, he noticed something peculiar. Beside the entry for the painting, there was a gap, an erasure of sorts, not in the image, but in the words. A phrase had been scratched out, leaving only faint curves of letters. He traced them with his finger, trying to guess what had once been there. He could not read it clearly, yet the absence pressed upon him. He dreamed that night of a single word whispered over and over, yet never clear enough to catch. He woke with his mouth dry, as though he had been speaking in his sleep. The restorer admitted something similar. While working, she sometimes felt the urge to speak aloud, though no words came. Her lips would part, her breath would form sound, but the word dissolved before leaving her mouth. She wrote in her journal, "There is a word in the painting. It is not painted, not spoken, yet it waits. A word not said, but present." Together, they searched manuscripts, hoping to find it. They read the forbidden diagrams, the monk's maps, the margin notes. Each hinted at something unnamed, better hidden than seen, too direct for display, the threshold. But none gave the word itself. The archivist grew convinced the word was deliberate absence, that the artist had built silence into the work, a silence shaped like language, waiting to be filled by the viewer's own voice. He whispered once to the restorer, "Perhaps the word cannot be given, it must be found within." She disagreed. She felt the word lived, specific, sharp, but buried beneath layers of paint and time. Not metaphor, but name. She grew restless, listening for it in her dreams. One night, she dreamed of standing before the curtain. She drew it aside, and the painting glowed with light. The figures looked at her, their eyes steady, their hands folded. The hand pointed outward, the line divided, the 3 marks shone like stars. She leaned closer and saw, beneath the surface, faint letters traced in gold. She tried to read them, but each time they blurred. She woke, gasping, the taste of the word on her tongue but gone before she could grasp it. She wrote, "The word is not lost. It waits. It is the seed at the heart of the painting. It is the alarm, the dust, the path, the gaze. Everything points to it. Everything holds silence until it is spoken." The archivist no longer slept easily. He avoided the gallery, fearing that if he looked again, the word would press itself upon him. He believed once it was known, it could not be forgotten. He was not ready. But the restorer longed for it. She felt the painting whispering, not with sound, but with presence, pressing the word into her skin until she trembled. And so the painting lived on, not with brush or pigment alone, but with the silence of a word not said, a silence more powerful than any proclamation, a silence that promised revelation to whoever dared to hear it. The archivist had grown thin in recent months. His colleagues noticed how his hands shook when he carried volumes, how his eyes drifted not across text but toward shadows. They thought it was age, or perhaps the strain of long nights among the shelves, but the truth was simpler and far more troubling. The painting had followed him. He had stopped visiting the gallery. He no longer dared to pass the curtain. Yet, even without standing before it, he felt its weight. The hand that pointed outward haunted him whenever he closed his eyes. The line that divided cut through his thoughts. The word not said pressed at his tongue until his jaw ached with silence. He tried to bury himself in other tasks. He copied documents with precise ink, catalogued minor works, restored order to forgotten lists. But each ledger seemed to echo with absence. He saw scratches where words had been removed, gaps where names once stood. He began to believe the painting had trained his eyes to notice erasure everywhere. At night, his tremor grew worse. He dreamed of corridors filled with shelves, yet every book he reached for dissolved to dust in his hands. In the distance, a hand pointed forward, urging him deeper into emptiness. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart hammering as though chased. He confessed once to the restorer. They sat together in a quiet corner of the library, the smell of old paper clinging to them. His voice shook. "It is not only in the gallery," he whispered. "It is in me. The painting, the silence, the word. I feel it every time I breathe." The restorer did not dismiss him. She too knew the presence that lingered beyond canvas, but she feared for him, for his body was frail, his hands unsteady. She wondered whether the painting was not calling him, but consuming him. One evening, the archivist failed to return home. The guards found him hours later, sitting on the gallery floor before the curtain. The key had not been used, the fabric still hung heavy, but his hands rested on his knees, trembling violently, his eyes fixed on the cloth as though it were transparent. He whispered only one sentence when they lifted him to his feet. "The word is too heavy to speak." He was reassigned soon after. His superiors claimed exhaustion, recommending rest. But, among the staff, whispers grew. They said the painting had claimed another, not through sight but through silence. They said the archivist's tremor was the sound of the word, trying to escape through his bones. The restorer read his journals after he left. The final page contained no words, only 3 small marks drawn with careful precision. The restorer returned to her work each day, though her nights grew longer. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that pulled her into corridors of shadow. She no longer feared them. She entered willingly, knowing the painting waited even there. One night, the dream carried her further than before. She stood once again in the narrow passage between halves, the third path glowing faintly beneath her feet. The figures on either side prayed with eyes open, watching her as she walked. Ahead, the hand pointed toward a door carved into stone. On its surface were the 3 marks, sharper now, almost alive. She reached for them. Her fingers touched the stone, and warmth spread through her hand. The marks glowed, and the door dissolved. Beyond it lay not darkness, but a chamber filled with light, soft and golden. At its centre stood the faceless figure of the artist, brush in hand. They moved silently, painting upon a canvas that shimmered as though woven from air. She stepped closer, but the figure raised a hand, not to stop her, but to steady her. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears. She did not know why she had wept, only that the dream had felt more real than waking. The following day, she approached the canvas in the gallery with new reverence. The surface seemed gentler, less hostile. The varnish reflected her lamp like water. She felt as though she had crossed a threshold, and the painting recognized her as no longer stranger. She whispered aloud, though no one was near, "I will not betray you." Euphumindra's closed at these intact. Her journal that evening held only one line. The night is no longer silence, it is instruction. But instruction came at a cost. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid. She walked deeper into the hidden chambers, hearing whispers that pressed against her chest. Sometimes she woke with her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes open, mirroring the figures she studied each day. Sometimes she woke standing beside her bed, arm outstretched, finger pointing forward into the dark. The painting had entered her body. It shaped her gestures, her breath, her sleep. She did not resist. Resistance felt impossible now. Others noticed her change. The guards said her eyes looked different, brighter, though she seemed more tired. One colleague whispered that she carried herself like someone half in shadow, half in light. She did not answer their questions. She knew only this: the painting no longer waited for her to look. It looked back, every hour, every breath. The curtain had always hung as fabric, plain, coarse, practical. But over time, it became something more. Those who approached felt its presence before even touching it. The air thickened, the silence pressed closer. It was as though the curtain itself carried the centuries of fear, decision, and secrecy sewn into its threads. The restorer once reached out to draw it aside. Her hand froze inches from the cloth. It was not reverence that stopped her, nor command. It was weight. She felt it pressing against her palm before contact, as though the curtain were heavier than stone. She lowered her hand, trembling. The guards spoke of similar experiences. Some said the curtain breathed. Others said it pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat. None wished to linger near it. They passed quickly, eyes forward, unwilling to test what waited behind. One night, the restorer stayed late. Alone in the gallery, she sat before the curtain, her tools packed away. She watched the fabric ripple slightly, though no wind touched it. She whispered, "You are not hiding it. You are part of it." The words surprised her, yet they felt true. The curtain was no longer barrier. It was participant. In her dreams, the curtain appeared again, vast and endless, stretching like sky. She walked toward it, hand raised, but never touched. Instead, the fabric opened on its own, folding silently aside. Beyond it lay the painting, brighter than any lamp could cast. She woke with her chest heavy, as though she carried the curtain within her lungs. She wrote, "The curtain is not to keep us out. It is to prepare us. It teaches patience, reverence, silence. To stand before it is already to stand within the painting." The archivist, though absent now, had once written something similar. His notes spoke of thresholds, of the space before revelation. Perhaps the curtain was the first threshold, the first layer of silence, preparing the gaze for what lay beyond. The Vatican left it hanging, not because it was practical, but because it was necessary. To strip it away would be to confront the painting, naked, unmediated, unbearable. The cloth was mercy, not concealment. And yet, for those who had seen beneath, the curtain's weight became part of the mystery. It carried the silence of the word not said, the tremor of the archivist, the tears of the restorer, the fear of the guards. It was no longer fabric, it was history itself, draped between sight and revelation. Those who stood before it, even without pulling it aside, felt changed. The curtain itself had become a painting, woven not of pigment but of silence. And behind it, always, the hand pointed forward, steady, unyielding, waiting. The chamber chosen for the meeting was not grand. It was small, panelled in dark wood, the air heavy with incense that lingered from earlier vespers. No windows, no sunlight. Only the dim light of lamps placed carefully to reveal the table and obscure the faces. Men gathered there not as friends, nor even as colleagues, but as guardians of something older than themselves. The subject of the gathering was unspoken yet understood. Each man had heard the whispers. Each had felt the pressure of silence thickening around the gallery. The painting had survived centuries hidden, but now, with restoration advancing and fragments discovered, it had begun to stir once more. No one dared speak its title, for it had none. It was referred to only as the matter. Reports were placed on the table, pigment analyses, descriptions of the underlayers, notes from the archivist who had since withdrawn. The documents trembled slightly in the hands of those who passed them, though the room was still. One voice broke the quiet. "It unsettles," he said, the words slow, careful. Another followed, firmer. "Unsettling can spread. It is easier to bury doubt than to explain it." A third countered, weary but resolute. "And yet burying has not worked. It returns. Always." The restorer's name was mentioned, though not loudly. Some wanted her work halted. Others argued her silence could be trusted. The archivist was deemed too unstable, too compromised by tremor and dream. But the painting no one could agree on its fate. To display it would invite danger. To destroy it would be blasphemy. To lock it forever would be confession of fear. Each option was failure. The oldest among them finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried weight. "It is not paint we fear," he said. "It is gaze. Whoever looks too long begins to hear. Whoever hears begins to change. That is what we guard against. Not colour, not brush, but silence that instructs more loudly than any sermon." The others fell quiet. His words rang true. They agreed on no resolution. They left with no decree, only the heaviness of decisions unmade. Yet the room carried a shift. Something had been admitted aloud, something none wished to name. The painting was alive. That night, several of the men dreamed of standing before the curtain. None dared to pull it aside, but all awoke with the same sensation, a hand pressing lightly against their chest, pointing forward, urging them into a path they could not yet walk. The meeting of shadows ended without verdict, but its silence joined the weight of centuries, another layer draped across the unseen canvas. The restorer had grown accustomed to silence, but lately it followed her differently. It pressed against her ears, not as absence of sound, but as presence of something vast. She began to feel that each moment she spent before the painting was a step downward, deeper into a chamber that existed beneath the world itself. Her dreams confirmed it. She no longer wandered corridors at random. She descended. Each night, she found herself walking a staircase of stone that spiraled into shadow. At each turn, torches burned, their flames steady, their light golden. The walls were marked with the 3 strokes she had first discovered in pigment. She counted them as she passed, hundreds upon hundreds, each one a threshold. At the base, she always found a chamber. Sometimes it was empty. Sometimes the artist stood there, brush in hand. Sometimes only the painting waited, larger than life, its figures moving slightly, their eyes meeting hers. And always, always, the hand pointed forward, deeper still, though no further path appeared. She woke each time before she could follow. In her waking hours, she began to notice echoes of the descent in the gallery itself. The floor beneath her seemed to slope gently, though her instruments showed it level. The air grew cooler near the curtain. Her tools slipped more easily from her fingers, as though gravity itself had shifted. She wrote in her journal, The painting is not on the wall, it is below. Each stroke I clean is a step further down. I fear there may be no bottom. One afternoon, she lingered after the lamps were extinguished. Alone in the dim light, she placed her palm against the curtain, then the frame. The wood felt warmer than it should, as if it carried breath. She closed her eyes and imagined herself falling through it, down the stair she had walked in dreams. Her heart quickened, and she drew back. Yet the sensation remained the certainty that the painting was not surface, not symbol, but entrance. The descent continued each night. She stopped resisting. She let the stairs carry her, her hand tracing the marks along the wall. She whispered words she did not know she knew, syllables soft as prayer. When she woke, her lips were still moving. Those around her began to notice her pallor, the faint shadows beneath her eyes. They asked if she was ill. She only smiled faintly, unwilling to confess the truth. She was not unwell. She was elsewhere. And the elsewhere grew closer with every step. It was the archivist who first named it. In one of his final coherent entries, scribbled with trembling hand, he wrote, "There is a threshold made of silence. Step across, and nothing is ever the same." The restorer read those words long after his departure. They struck her as truer than anything she had yet seen. She had felt the silence herself, not absence but weight, not emptiness but fullness. It was a silence that did not quiet the world, it transformed it. She thought of the curtain, how it hung heavy with centuries of unspoken fear. She thought of the underlayers, the figures with eyes open in prayer, the third path glowing faintly between halves. All of it pointed to the same place, silence as passage. One evening, she stayed in the gallery long past the guards' rounds. Alone with the curtain, she sat in stillness. She did not reach for the fabric. She did not study the surface. She only listened. At first, she heard nothing. Then she heard her own breath, steady but sharp. Then she felt her heartbeat, slow but strong. Then, beneath both, she felt something else, a rhythm that was not hers, a pulse older, deeper, surrounding her. She closed her eyes. The silence deepened, wrapping around her like cloth. She felt herself step forward without moving, as though her body had crossed a line invisible to the eye. She did not see the painting. She became part of it. The figures were beside her, hands folded, eyes open. The line divided, yet she stood in the middle, the hand pointed forward, not to canvas, but to her own chest. She felt the 3 marks burn faintly above her heart. And then, in that silence, she heard it not with ears, but with being, the word not said. It did not arrive as sound, it arrived as knowing, sharp and absolute. She gasped, tears flooding her eyes, though her lips remained closed. She could never write it, she could never speak it. Yet it lived in her now, undeniable, immovable. When she opened her eyes, the curtain still hung. The gallery was still dim. Nothing had changed. Yet everything had. She wrote in her journal that night, "I crossed. I cannot return." The silence was the door. The word waits within. I will carry it until it carries me. The next morning, those who saw her swore she looked different. Not younger, not older, but brighter, as though her skin carried faint light. They whispered among themselves, but did not ask. Some avoided her gaze. Others felt drawn to her without knowing why. The threshold of silence was real. The archivist had spoken true, and once crossed, it left no return. The restorer no longer feared the painting. She no longer questioned it. She belonged to it now, as much as the dust of the studio, as much as the hidden layers, as much as the curtain itself. And still, the hand pointed forward. The Vatican has many halls that few remember. They stretch behind archives, beneath chapels, through stairways that curve without end. Some lead nowhere, some lead everywhere. The guards walk them at night, but never slowly, never lingering. They say the stones there carry memory like breath. It was in one such hall that the echoes began. At first, a faint sound, as if of whispers pressed into stone, then louder, clearer, though no mouths moved. The sound was not words but presence, as though the walls themselves had absorbed centuries of silence and were now exhaling. The restorer passed through one of these halls, late one evening. She had been summoned for a routine task, or so she was told. Her footsteps rang soft against the marble, her lamp casting narrow circles of light. Yet each step returned to her not as simple echo, but as layered chorus, as though countless others had walked before her and were walking still. She paused. The silence grew heavier, folding over her. She closed her eyes, and the echoes changed. They no longer repeated her steps, they spoke. Not with words, but with rhythm, with pulse, with knowing. It was the same rhythm she had felt behind the curtain, the same silence that had pressed the word into her. The hall carried it. The hall itself was part of the painting. She leaned against the wall, her hand resting on the cool stone. Beneath her palm, she felt movement, faint vibrations, like heartbeat through rock. She whispered, "You are not hall, you are threshold." And in that moment, she knew the painting did not live on a single wall. It lived across the Vatican itself, hidden in spaces that seemed empty but were alive with silence. When she returned to her quarters, she wrote only, "The painting breathes through the halls. The stone carries its voice. We are inside it even when far away." The guards later spoke of strange nights. They would patrol the hall and hear footsteps behind them, though no one followed. They would hear faint sighs, like prayer too soft to name. Some refused to walk those routes again, claiming the walls leaned closer with every step. The Vatican tried to dismiss it. Drafts, they said, acoustics, old stone carrying sound. But those who walked there knew otherwise. They felt the same pull the restorer had felt, the sense that the painting was no longer contained. The hall had become another curtain, another veil, and behind it the same hand pointed forward, urging those who entered to listen. The ring of keys passed from guard to guard, each man reluctant, each hand unsteady. They were heavy not in weight but in meaning, for the one key that mattered most was the one none wished to use. The key to the gallery, the key to the curtain. One evening, a young guard, newly assigned, dared to turn it. He told himself he was only checking locks, only ensuring the hinges had not rusted. He told himself curiosity was duty, not defiance. But when the door swung open, the air struck him like a wave. The gallery was dark. The curtain stood still, yet seemed to glow faintly in shadow. He stepped inside, his boots tapping too loudly. He told himself he would not touch it, he would not look. He would only stand for a moment, prove to himself the fear was foolish. But the silence grew thicker, wrapping around him like water. He raised his hand before he realized it. His fingers brushed the fabric, soft but heavy, warmer than cloth should be. He froze. Then, without meaning to, he pulled. The curtain slid aside with a sound like breath. The painting glimmered in the dark, shapes shifting in his vision. The hand pointed forward, straight into his chest. He gasped and stumbled back, letting the curtain fall shut. He locked the door quickly, his heart hammering. But the weight did not leave him. That night, he dreamed of holding the keys in his hand. Each key turned itself, one by one, opening not doors, but layers of his own chest. Inside, he saw the 3 marks glowing like fire. He woke shaking, the keys clutched tightly in his fist, though he had not gone to the gallery again. After that, he refused to carry the ring. He begged for reassignment, claiming illness. The keys passed on, heavier than before. The restorer heard of it and understood. The turning of keys was not simple action, it was initiation. Whoever turned them was drawn closer, chosen without asking. She wrote, "The keys are not metal. They are decision. To carry them is to agree, whether you mean to or not." The Vatican could replace guards. It could assign new hands. But each man who carried the ring carried also the weight of silence. Some turned away quickly, others lingered too long, but none remained unchanged. The turning of keys was another gesture of the hand, another invitation, another choice. The Vatican had weathered centuries of questions, doubts, reforms. It had survived fire, war, and the weight of time. But nothing unsettled it more than silence that could not be named. And that silence now spread, carried by the painting hidden behind curtain, whispered through halls, pressed into stone. The divide began quietly. Some insisted the painting was danger, its very presence an infection of certainty. They argued it should be sealed forever, locked in vaults so deep no eye could find it again. Others, fewer but firmer, whispered that it should be studied, that perhaps it was not threat but revelation. Meetings grew tense. Reports were rewritten, softened, erased. Margins, filled with notes that contradicted official lines. Guards told their stories in hushed voices. Archivists slipped fragments into hidden drawers. Restorers kept journals they dared not share. The institution spoke unity, but beneath, it fractured. One cardinal declared in private, "It points away from us. That is why it terrifies. If the faithful see, they may realize they need no guardians." His words never reached paper, but those who heard them carried the tremor of truth in their bones. The restorer felt the divide most keenly. She saw the fear in some faces, the hunger in others. She herself no longer feared. She had crossed the threshold of silence, carried the word within her. She knew the painting was not curse, it was map. Yet she also knew maps can unmake kingdoms. The Vatican became two bodies within one skin, outwardly serene, inwardly trembling. Some pressed for concealment, some for revelation. No consensus, only fracture. The painting did not move, yet it shifted the ground beneath them. And still, the curtain hung. Still, the hand pointed forward. Still, the silence pressed upon all who entered, demanding choice. The Vatican divide was not battle, not argument, but quiet unravelling. A tapestry loosening thread by thread, undone not by fire or sword, but by gaze, by silence, by word not spoken yet heard. The restorer wrote in her journal, "It will not be the world that forces them. It will be the painting itself. It waits. It knows. It divides not by will, but by presence. It has already begun." And so it was. A canvas hidden in shadow, a hand pointing forward, a silence carrying word, enough to fracture the oldest walls, enough to set even stone trembling. The night air was cold, the lamps dim, the corridors empty of footsteps. Yet deep within a chamber lined with heavy books, a council gathered in whispers. No summons had been issued. No record would be made. The men arrived one by one, their robes brushing the stone floor, their eyes lowered, as though ashamed to look at one another. The subject was unspoken but present, heavier than the incense clinging to their sleeves. The painting, always the painting. For months, unease had grown, guards resigning, archivists trembling. The restorer pale with silence that no one could break. The curtain had become an object of fear, and fear had begun to bleed into words. A cardinal broke the hush first. "It must end," he whispered, voice cracked by age and caution. "We cannot allow it to remain. Too many have seen, too many have heard." Another, younger, sharper, leaned forward. "And if we destroy it?" His question was not suggestion, but challenge. The older man recoiled as though struck. To destroy would be to confess. To confess would be to admit there was something to fear. The room divided quickly, though their voices never rose above whisper. Some argued for concealment, burial beneath vaults too deep for memory. Others, fewer but stronger, demanded it be studied. "If it holds truth," one said, "should we not be guardians of that truth rather than its jailers?" Silence stretched between them. None wished to be the one to decide, for decision would leave a mark. Yet beneath their words lay deeper tremors, the fear that the painting had already decided for them. One man, quiet until then, spoke at last. His voice was calm, steady, almost tender. "It divides us," he said. "Not by choice, but by presence. We stand now in halves, as it stands, left and right, devotion and awakening, and between, a path we cannot yet walk." The words chilled the room, for in their hearts each knew it true. When the council ended, they dispersed into the night, robes swaying like shadows. No resolutions were made, no decrees issued. Yet each man carried the silence heavier than before. And when they lay in their beds, each dreamed of the same thing, a hand pointing forward, urging them toward a threshold none dared to cross. The whispered council ended, as it had begun in silence. But the silence had changed. It was no longer theirs to control. The restorer had grown thin. Her eyes shone with a brightness that unsettled those who looked too long. She worked still, her hands steady, her tools precise. Yet her presence carried something more, an absence of distance, as though she lived in two worlds at once. One evening, while bent over the canvas, she felt her breath falter. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred. She steadied herself, but her knees buckled, and she collapsed upon the stone floor. The guards rushed in, lifting her gently. Her hands clutched at the air as though holding invisible threads. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. She was carried to her quarters, her work unfinished. Physicians came, pressing cool cloths to her brow, muttering of exhaustion. They prescribed rest, silence, distance from her work. But they did not understand. The collapse was not of body but of weight. She had carried too much of the painting within her, and it had pressed against her until she fell. In her dreams, she descended the staircase once more, deeper than ever before. The torches burned brighter, the marks along the wall shone with light. At the base, she found the chamber, but it was no longer empty. The figures from the painting stood there, alive, their eyes open, their hands folded. They surrounded her, silent but steady, their gaze pressing against her like a tide. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed. The hand pointed forward. But forward led not to passage. Forward led into her chest, into the word she carried but had not spoken. She gasped, and the chamber dissolved. She woke trembling, her body drenched in sweat, her breath shallow, yet her eyes burned with new fire. She whispered to herself, "It waits in me." The physicians declared her weak. The superiors considered her compromised. They spoke of removing her from her task. But she knew removal was impossible. She could not be separated from the painting, for it no longer lived only behind the curtain. It lived in her chest, in her dreams. She returned to her tools against their orders. She sat once more before the curtain, her hand resting on the frame. The guards watched nervously, whispering among themselves. She whispered too, but not to them, to the silence, to the word, to the painting that breathed with her. The collapse had not broken her, it had bound her. The Vatican is built upon stone, but even stone trembles when silence grows too loud. The divide within its walls deepened with each passing day. Some demanded the painting's destruction. Others whispered of its preservation. None trusted one another. The breaking point came not with decision, but with accident. A young seminarian, curious and naive, slipped past the guards one night. He had heard whispers, fragments of rumour. He wanted to see. He pulled the curtain aside with trembling hands. What he saw, no one knows, for he never spoke of it. But when the guards found him, he was kneeling before the painting, hands folded, eyes wide open. They tried to rouse him, but he did not move. His lips formed a word soundlessly, over and over. He remained there until dawn, unshaken, unblinking, alive, yet elsewhere. The event spread through the halls, like fire through dry wood. Some claimed miracle, some claimed possession, others feared contagion. The council reconvened, this time not in whispers, but in urgency. Voices rose, robes rustled, hands slammed upon the table. The silence had become visible. undeniable, embodied in the boy who would not close his eyes. The Vatican fractured openly that night. Some demanded exorcism, others demanded reverence. The word blasphemy collided with the word revelation until the chamber shook with contradiction. No decree could contain it, no silence could bury it. Meanwhile, the restorer stood alone before the curtain, her hand pressed against the fabric. She felt the tremor in the walls, the fracture in the voices. She whispered, "It begins." The painting remained silent, yet its silence was louder than the cries of the council, heavier than their decrees, stronger than their fear. It pointed forward, as always, unyielding. And those who dared look knew the truth. The Vatican had reached its breaking point. The stone still stood, the curtain still hung, the figures still prayed with eyes open, yet nothing could return to what it was. The breaking point had come. The silence would no longer be contained. Rome is a city of noise. Bells ring from towers, scooters hum across cobblestones, tourists chatter in dozens of tongues. Yet one evening, as dusk settled across the river, a quietness spread. It was not absence of sound, but a weight beneath it, a stillness so heavy it bent the noise until even laughter seemed muted. The silence began near the walls of the Vatican, but did not stop there. It drifted outward through alleys and piazzas, into shops and churches, seeping into homes. Families paused at dinner tables, spoons resting mid-air, drivers slowed their cars without knowing why. Even the fountains seemed to soften their spray. No decree was issued, no bells silenced, no orders given. Yet the city felt it together, the strange hush that carried no explanation. Children clutched their parents' hands. Old men stared at the ground. Strangers exchanged glances but said nothing. The restorer, walking alone through a narrow street, felt it strongest. She carried her journal pressed to her chest, the weight of the words still unspoken burning inside her. As the silence spread, she realized it was not merely the absence of sound, it was recognition. The city itself had begun to listen. By morning, the hush had faded. Rome returned to its rhythm, its chaos, its song. But those who had felt it could not forget. Vendors whispered about it as they set out their stalls. Priests lowered their voices when speaking of it in homilies. A rumor spread that the Vatican was hiding something, and the city had felt its pulse. The Vatican denied it, as always. Yet denial mattered little now. The silence had stepped beyond the walls, carried in the breath of the people. Rome itself had become another listener. The restorer wrote, "The painting has no frame. It is not bound to wall or curtain. Its silence spreads like smoke." Today, Rome inhaled it. The archivist had disappeared quietly, removed for his tremor, his collapse, his whispered warnings. Many thought him gone for good, lost to frailty and dream. Yet one night, as rain lashed against the stones, he returned. His steps were unsteady, his robes damp, but his eyes burned with a clarity none had seen before. He carried no books, no notes, no ink, only his hands, trembling still, but steady enough to open the doors that others feared. He walked past the guards without hesitation. They tried to stop him, but something in his gaze froze them. He passed through corridors and halls until he reached the gallery. The curtain hung heavy, unmoved. He paused before it, breathing shallow. His hands shook as they had always done, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "I am ready," he whispered. He drew the fabric aside. The painting glowed faintly in the lamplight, its figures alive, its hands steady. The archivist stepped forward, his body trembling but his eyes fixed. He did not collapse this time. He did not turn away. He fell to his knees, hands clasped, eyes wide open. Those who followed found him there, whispering words too soft to catch. They leaned close, straining to hear, but the syllables dissolved before reaching their ears. Yet they felt the meaning press against their chests, as though the silence itself carried his prayer. He remained before the canvas until dawn. When the sun broke across the city, He rose slowly, turned, and walked out. He spoke nothing to those who questioned him. He returned to his quarters, shut the door, and began to write. For days he wrote without pause. Pages filled with trembling script, maps of silence, diagrams of marks, words that shifted between languages. He wrote until his hands bled, ink staining his sleeves. When he finally stopped, he left the journal stacked neatly, a ring of keys resting on top. Then he vanished once more, this time without trace. The restorer read his final pages. They were not explanation, they were invitation. Phrases like, "The silence is not absence but compass. The path divides but leads to center. The word lives in those who carry it." She wept as she read. The archivist had returned not for closure but for offering. He had given the silence form. He had given the painting voice. And then he had gone, leaving behind the certainty that he had stepped beyond thresholds none could yet follow. The Vatican feared fire more than anything, not the flames themselves, but the rumor of them. Fire meant loss, destruction, revelation. Fire meant chaos unbound, smoke that could not be contained. And soon, whispers of fire began to spread. It began with a guard, drunk on cheap wine, muttering in a tavern. He claimed the painting was dangerous, that if it were not burned soon, it would consume them all. Others heard, and the story twisted. Some said the Vatican planned to burn it secretly. Others swore it had already been set aflame, and only ashes remained. Still others claimed the fire was not physical, but spiritual, already burning through those who had seen too much. The rumors spread through Rome like sparks on dry straw. Merchants argued in markets, priests calmed, frightened parishioners, scholars demanded answers. Pilgrims began to gather near the walls, whispering prayers not for saints, but for truth. The Vatican denied everything, as always, but the denial only fed suspicion. For every word spoken, silence grew heavier, and silence always spoke louder. The restorer heard the rumors and trembled. She knew the painting lived beyond canvas, beyond curtain, beyond hall. It could not be destroyed by flame. Yet she feared what fire symbolized. Fear made desperate, secrecy turned violent. One evening, as she stood again before the curtain, she smelled smoke, though no candle burned. She turned quickly, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Only silence, pressing against her, steady as ever. She whispered, "You will not burn." That night, her dreams were filled with fire. The painting burned before her eyes, its pigments melting, its canvas curling. Yet from the ashes rose not ruin, but light, brighter than any flame. The figures remained, hands folded, eyes open, the hand still pointed forward, and the word, unspoken but alive, burned in her chest without consuming her. She woke gasping, the scent of smoke lingering in her lungs. The rumor of fire had not yet become reality, but it had already spread enough to fracture further, enough to terrify, enough to call forth choices. The Vatican faced silence within and fire without. One or the other would consume it, perhaps both. And still the curtain hung, still the silence pressed, still the hand pointed forward. The restorer wrote in her journal, "It will not burn, or if it burns, it will not end." Fire cannot destroy silence. It can only reveal it more brightly. It began with a handful of figures standing quietly at the outer wall. They were not tourists, nor scholars, nor clergy. They were ordinary people who had heard whispers of silence, of fire, of a painting that unsettled the very heart of faith. They came not for spectacle, but for presence. They stood, hands folded, eyes open, waiting. At first the guards ignored them. A few strangers outside the gates were nothing new, but more came each day. Farmers from the countryside, mothers with children, students with notebooks, old men leaning on canes. They came without banners, without demands, without slogans. They came only to stand, and as they stood, silence spread. The square outside the gate grew hushed, as though the very stones held their breath. Passers-by slowed, caught by the stillness. Some joined, placing their hands together, opening their eyes wide. Others hurried away, unsettled. The Vatican grew uneasy. Pilgrims were welcome. Of course, Rome thrived on them. But this was different. These were not seekers of relics or saints. They sought something the church could not name aloud. The guards were ordered to disperse them, but dispersal proved difficult. There was no protest to break, no chance to drown out. Only silence, only presence. At night, the restorer dreamed of them. She saw their faces lit by moonlight, their eyes mirroring the figures on the canvas. She felt their silence pressing through the walls, reaching into the gallery itself. She woke with tears on her cheeks. She whispered, "They hear it too." By dawn, the crowd doubled. By week's end, the square was filled. Some knelt, some stood, some wept softly, though none spoke. The silence became so heavy that even pigeons avoided the square. The Vatican's bells tolled as always, but their chimes seemed hollow, unable to pierce the quiet. The officials debated in frantic meetings. To open the gates would be dangerous. To ignore the crowd was impossible. To explain was unthinkable. Yet the people kept coming. The silence did not weaken, it grew. And at the heart of it, hidden behind curtain and wall, the painting waited. The hand pointed forward, the eyes watched, the silence spoke. The Vatican gate trembled, not from force, but from stillness pressing against them. The guards had been trained for order, not silence. They knew how to part crowds with their presence, how to keep tourists in line, how to shield doors with steady bodies. But nothing in their training prepared them for people who came only to stand. One guard, younger than most, found himself assigned to the gate night after night. At first, he bristled at the duty. He mocked the pilgrims in his mind, muttering about superstition. But, as the nights lengthened, his heart shifted. He began to notice their faces. Some were lined with age, others smooth with youth. Some bore sorrow, others hope. Yet all carried the same gaze open, unwavering, awake. Their eyes reminded him of the figures in the painting, though he had never dared to look at it himself. He wondered if the silence outside the gates was the same silence inside the gallery. One evening, as rain fell, he lingered after his shift. He should have gone home, but he remained, watching the pilgrims stand unmoved by weather, his hand, almost without thought, folded across the other. His eyes lifted. He stood with them. The silence pressed against his chest. It was not heavy, not suffocating. It was steady. It steadied him. He felt his breath slow, his mind clear. For the first time in years, he felt no division within himself. Only stillness, only gaze. When the bells rang, breaking the hour, he lowered his hands quickly, ashamed, yet the sensation lingered. He returned the next night, and the next, each time, staying a little longer after his duty. The pilgrims began to recognize him, though none spoke. Their silence welcomed him as one of their own. Rumours spread among the guards. They said one of their own had joined the crowd. Some laughed, some sneered, some grew afraid, but the young guard no longer cared. He had found something he could not name, something the Vatican could not forbid. In his dreams, he saw the curtain ripple. He saw the hand point not outward but inward, into his chest. He woke each morning with the same thought: the silence has chosen me. The Vatican noticed his change. They considered reassignment, perhaps dismissal, but they hesitated, for to punish him would be to admit the silence had power, and that, more than any disobedience, terrified them. So the guard remained, and each night he stood a little closer to the pilgrims, until he was no longer guard, no longer watcher. He was one of them. The Vatican had managed for centuries to keep the curtain in place, to drape silence with cloth, to cover mystery with fabric. But cloth frays, threads loosen, veils weaken. And one night, as storm winds howled through the city, the curtain fell. No hand tore it, no blade cut it. The storm itself reached through the gallery window, rattling shutters, tugging at fabric, pulling it down. Guards rushed in, their lamps swaying wildly. They froze at the sight, the painting fully visible, glowing faintly in the storm's light. The figures prayed with eyes open. The hand pointed forward, the line divided. The 3 marks burned faintly at the base. The guards did not move. One fell to his knees, his lamp clattering against stone. Another covered his face, but could not look away. The youngest wept without sound. The silence pressed harder than thunder, heavier than wind. News spread quickly. The veil had fallen. The painting was exposed. Whispers raced through halls and chambers. Some cried blasphemy. Some cried miracle. Some demanded the curtain restored at once. Others insisted it was too late. The restorer entered quietly. She saw the fabric lying on the floor, wet from storm, torn along its seam. She did not lift it. She did not try to cover the painting. She simply stood before it, her chest burning with the word unspoken, her eyes meeting the gaze of the figures she had carried within her for months. She whispered, "It begins." The storm raged outside, lightning flashing across the city. Pilgrims at the gate felt the shift, though they could not see. The silence deepened, pressing through stone into their chests. They fell to their knees together, eyes wide open, hands folded in prayer. The Vatican's walls trembled, not from storm, not from crowd, but from silence revealed. The veil was torn, and nothing, not storm nor decree, could cover it again. The storm had passed, but the air within the basilica felt heavier than ever before. Pilgrims outside the gates spoke in hushed tones of what had happened, though most could not name it directly. The veil had fallen. The painting was exposed. Inside, the high altar glowed with candlelight, and priests moved with ritual precision, chanting words as they had for centuries. But the chanting faltered that morning. A sound rose from the pews, not loud, not rebellious, but steady. A single man's voice, speaking softly. "Show us," he said, "show us." Others joined, not in shouting but in echo. "Show us." Their words pulsed through the stone, a rhythm older than speech. The priests froze, their eyes darting toward the doors that led deeper into the Vatican. The chant did not grow louder, but it did grow heavier, a cry not of anger but of longing. Not for spectacle, but for sight. The restorer sat among them, her body trembling. She did not join the chant, but she felt it press into her bones. She knew what they asked for. She knew the silence had already reached them. The officials convened quickly after. They debated, shouted, prayed, but the sound of the basilica lingered in their ears. The cry could not be dismissed. It was not rebellion, it was invitation. And invitation carried weight. That night, the restorer walked the basilica alone. The marble floor echoed her steps. She knelt near the altar, her hands clasped. She whispered the words she still carried silently within her chest. The sound did not leave her lips, but it filled the basilica like wind through columns. She felt the stone itself respond, a tremor beneath her knees. The basilica had heard the cry. The basilica had answered. From that night forward, each service carried unease. The chant might return at any moment. The people might call again, and the Vatican knew it could not silence every voice. The cry within the basilica was not protest. It was the beginning of revelation. The College of Cardinals had always projected unity. They dressed alike, spoke with measured cadence, sat in ordered ranks. But the painting had cracked their order as surely as the storm had torn the curtain. They gathered in the consistory hall, the great doors shut, guards stationed outside. The long table gleamed with polished wood, but the men around it were weary, their faces strained. Documents lay scattered, reports of the crowd, the basilica, the guard who had fallen to his knees before the painting. The debate began calmly, but calm could not hold. One cardinal, old and stern, slammed his hand on the table. "It is a threat," he declared. It unsettles the faithful. It divides us. It must be sealed, buried, erased. His voice trembled, not with weakness but with fear too raw to hide. Another, younger, eyes bright with fervour, rose in response. It is not threat, it is gift. If we bury it, we bury truth itself. The people already feel it. They already know. Shall we lie to them forever? The room erupted. Some shouted of blasphemy, others of revelation. Hands struck the table. Robes swayed. Voices clashed. Unity dissolved into open fracture. At last, the dean of the college raised his hand for silence. His voice, when it came, was soft but sharp. We are divided because it divides us. The painting itself has made the choice. It is not we who split it, is it that splits us? We cannot undo this. The words chilled the hall, for though each man disagreed on solution, all knew the truth of what he said. The painting had already fractured them. They were no longer one body. That night, rumours of the divide spread beyond the hall. Priests whispered of cardinals at odds. Pilgrims at the gate felt the tremor in the air. And the restorer, working late, wrote in her journal, "They fracture as the line fractures, left and right, eyes open, hands folded, and between them a path the institution cannot walk." The cardinals, divided not by policy nor by pride, but by silence itself. The pilgrims had grown in number. By day, they filled the square with silence. By night, they lingered, their bodies weary, but their eyes unyielding. And then, one evening, a woman lit a candle. She placed it on the ground before the gate, the flame trembling in the night air. She said nothing. She simply stood beside it, hands folded, eyes open. Others followed. Candles bloomed across the stones until the square shimmered with hundreds of small flames. The guards watched uneasily. Fire was forbidden, so close to the walls, but they could not bring themselves to extinguish it. The flames were too gentle, too steady. They did not threaten. They illuminated. The restorer stood at her window that night, gazing down at the square. She saw the candles flicker like stars fallen to earth. She whispered, "The fire is here, but it does not consume. It lights." Inside the gallery, the painting glowed faintly. The storm had taken the curtain, but now the candles carried its absence into ritual. Light outside mirrored light within. Silence in the square mirrored silence in the hall. The city itself had become participant. At midnight, the pilgrims knelt as one. Their flames wavered but did not die. Their silence pressed against the gates, against the walls, against the Vatican itself. The guards felt it in their chests. The priests felt it in their prayers. The cardinals felt it in their debates. The night of candles lasted until dawn. When the sun rose, the flames were extinguished, but their memory burned brighter than fire. The Vatican knew it then. Concealment was impossible. The silence had spread too far. The people had felt too much. Candles had become scripture. Flame had become voice. The restorer returned to the gallery at sunrise. She stood before the painting, the torn curtain still lying on the floor. She whispered, "They have joined you." And for the first time, she felt the silence answer, not within her chest, but around her, in the air, in the walls, in the city itself. The night of candles was not protest, not rebellion. It was communion, and communion cannot be hidden. It began without plan. At dusk, as the bells marked the hour, the pilgrims outside the gates rose together. No one gave command. No leader raised hand. They simply began to walk. They moved through the streets of Rome in silence, candles cradled in their palms, eyes wide and unblinking. The city's noise bent around them. Carts slowed, shopkeepers stilled. Even the fountains seemed to hush as the procession passed. The people did not sing. They did not chant. Their silence carried more weight than sound. The young guard, who had once stood among them, now walked at their side. He carried no weapon, only flame. His uniform marked him as Vatican servant, but his silence marked him as pilgrim. Those who saw him whispered, pointing, unsettled. A guard had crossed over. The restorer, too, felt their movement, though she did not join. She stood within the gallery, before the painting that no longer hid. The torn curtain lay folded at her feet. She whispered, "They are walking for you." The silence within the hall pressed outward, echoing the silence in the streets. She felt the city become extension of the canvas. The procession wound its way through alleys and piazzas, their candles flickering in the wind. Windows opened, more people joined. Some held children's hands, others carried nothing but themselves. They did not need to know the details of the painting. They did not need to see it. They had already felt its silence. By midnight, the procession circled back to the square. Thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the space with firelight. Their silence was so heavy that the guards at the gate trembled. Some turned their eyes away. Some lowered their weapons. The Vatican watched from behind closed windows. Officials whispered of danger, of rebellion, of heresy. Yet none dared step outside, for the silence was not directed against them. It was directed through them, toward what lay hidden beyond their walls. The procession ended, as it had begun without command. The people dispersed quietly, returning to their homes. But the memory lingered. Rome had walked as one body, one silence, one gaze. The Vatican's walls still stood. But they no longer separated.